Verbum Magia Part 5. It was morning again, or at least my body clock told me it was. So did the angry woman Tora, if the elven voice from the night before was to be believed. She was standing over me and tapping her foot. As soon as she saw my eyes open, she turned and left the room. She had kept her word about not showing me again, but I couldn't help but wonder if she would get in trouble I didn't appear for meals or our assigned job duties. By the time I'd stood and pulled on my fresh set of robes, she was long gone from my sight. I could vaguely hear steps in the distance, but I couldn't tell if they belonged to her or not. Thank goodness I'd taken time to memorize my way between my room and the mess hall the night before. In my groggy state, I only made one wrong turn and realized quickly enough. Just like the day before, we were served eggs and our strange orange gruel. Still tasteless, it at least kept my stomach from rumbling. This time, I wasn't the last to finish, and I quickly washed my bowl and left the crowded room. Tora didn't seem to be following me, so I wondered if she had other duties beyond those that she'd taught me yesterday. Not that it mattered. I had learned what I needed to, and knew I'd have no difficulty with the tasks. Honestly, the hardest part was remembering to bow to the damned elves. Plus, without her, I would be alone with the tomes and scrolls. Hopefully, I could tuck myself away with a few and try to find out how to get my voice back. The thought of my voice brought up thoughts of Yona. For such an angry elf who seemed to want me dead, she sure was attractive. I'd always liked the feisty women. If you can't get into a fight with someone over semantics, then make up afterwards. Was it even a relationship? Anyway, I thought I might have a chance of convincing her to give me my voice back. If she had wanted it to be permanent, she would have let Ortho cut out my tongue, and she hadn't. That was always a good sign. My trip to the archive was nowhere near as quick as the trip from my room to the mess hall. I hadn't had time to memorize the path yet, and as I worked my way lower, I made several wrong turns. A few dead ends and a smack across the back of my head later, and I was finally at the archive. Within moments of stepping into the stacks, I had my own little guide light. I bit my lip and looked up at the towering shelves. Did I get right to work trying to find a magical cure for my voicelessness? Or do I go get my day's work done as quickly as possible, then look? My instincts said to start looking for a cure right away. That made me turn and head straight for the returns desk. In this fucked up world, I couldn't trust my instincts at all. Look at where they'd gotten me so far. Dead, transported, set a magical study on fire, and then voiceless. So, if they said, look for the cure, I was sure as hell going to do anything but. So far, I'd only seen a handful of elves in the archives. The two who'd stood to greet me, then I'd heard at least one more in the study the night before, and there was an old woman and a young man I didn't recognize currently pursuing the stacks. I wondered if access to the archive was limited from those outside, or if elves simply didn't need to visit often. Other than Ortho, who very clearly hadn't been welcomed, I hadn't seen any non-elves in the archive. Looking over the returns, I quickly sorted them by category, and then before starting to take them to their homes, I leafed through the lot. It didn't take long for me to realize that dominant red books were histories, dominant blue was magic, and dominant yellow was what passed as fiction around here. I worked my way through putting away the reds and yellows before taking my time to place the blues. I pulled a few off the shelves as I went as well. If my hunch was right, blue purples would be magical history, blue greens would be spellcraft, and indigo would be spell tomes. Tucking my haul close to my chest, I sighed soundlessly at my lack of pockets. The elves very clearly did not want us to walk away with any of the tomes or scrolls. Looking to my left, then my right, I tried to spy the old elven woman and her young companion, but the archive was silent, and I didn't see any light bouncing around from their path either. Well, if I can't see them, they can't see me, right? I mentally shrugged before turning and looking for a place to read my armful. I cursed at my own light as every little nook I found lit up like the summer sun was out above it. It seemed to radiate outwards as if beckoning the elves to come find me. If my stomach was right, it was lunchtime about now. I definitely didn't want Tora to come looking for me, but I wasn't going to get another time to read. With a shake of my head as if mentally telling myself no, I sat in a back corner of the massive hall and started reading. I don't know how long I read, but my eyes burned, and even my faithful little light seemed dim when I looked up at the sound of someone's quick feet on the stone floor. It sounded like they were running. Running to hide or running to find? That was the question, wasn't it? I hadn't had any real success with my reading, other than learning that depending on the power level of the user, intent of the magic was clarified with the length of the spell. Someone very powerful, one word could be deadly by mistake. I thought of my use of fire and Ortho's use of open. Mine had lit a literal inferno, while his had barely opened a door, and Yona had used long, complicated sentences, clarifying and further clarifying what she'd wanted her magic to do. Brows pinched, I gathered up the scrolls and stood, walking calmly to the blue section. If there was one thing my father had taught me, it was act like you belong. If you act squirrely, people are going to question you. I was simply doing my job, returning scrolls to where they belonged on the shelf. There was no need for them to look at me twice if they noticed me at all. It was the young elf from this morning who had accompanied the elderly elven woman. The teen, who in all honesty was probably older than me, was alone and had their brows pinched in a look of frustration. I couldn't determine if it was a boy or a girl, as the not yet mature looked nearly identical in face and body shape. Down one blue row, then up the one I was currently occupying, then down a third. They paused, then paced back and forth on the opposite side of the shelf I was currently facing. I couldn't see them from here, but I could hear muttered curses and the sound of fingers rifling through pages. If memory served me right, that was the section on how to best perform spell work. Intonation, word choice, and syntax were all critical to getting the results you wanted. Then, as quickly as the teen had come, they were leaving again, this time with 2 tomes and a scroll. My curiosity dug at me, and I wanted to know what was so important that the elf had needed to run in here and then right back out. Perhaps when they returned the items tomorrow or the next day, I would get a chance to find out. My stomach grumbled then, and I shrugged. Either I would find out, or I wouldn't. It wasn't like I was exactly short on time here. Thinking of time, I looked around for any indicator of just how long I'd been tucked away reading. The worst part of these strange above-ground caves was that there were no windows, and as far as I determined, nothing inside to keep time with. Not even the candles that were used in other buildings were used here. The paper rolls and books far too flammable. I finished returning my reading materials to the shelves, then headed to the mess hall. I'd either be able to eat or I wouldn't. Whether I was too early or too late wouldn't matter. Enough days in this place, and my body clock would eventually adjust. It just might mean a few missed meals in the meantime. To my surprise, it was actually just into the evening meal when I arrived. I got a few angry glares, mostly from Tora and the cook, but was quickly handed a bowl and a mug. A tentative sip revealed the drink was some sort of spiced tea, one of the most pleasant things I'd consumed since I'd arrived. The food in the bowl looked like some sort of goopy stew, but much like the rest of the food we slaves were fed, it was nearly tasteless. I ate it down quickly, but savored my tea. I finished eating long before the others, who were quietly chatting about their day, the duties they still had, and what to expect tomorrow to entail. No one even looked at me. Not much conversation to be had with a mute after all, and when they finished eating got up, washed their bowls and mugs, then left. I was left sitting, still sipping on my tea, unwilling to let the taste go. Cook barked a sharp order at me to clean up my mess before I left, then turned and left the room, leaving me alone in the now dim room. Only the light from the single remaining glowing ball and the embers of the day's cooking fire remained. I leaned my head back against the rough wall behind me and closed my eyes. My hands were wrapped around the now cool mug, and I let out a silent sigh. I was unhappy with my life since dying. The ironic thought made me chuckle. Another sip of my tea, and I frowned. Working in a library should be my dream job, but the fact that I am a slave to a race of elves who speak freaking Latin just gets my goat. I click my tongue, satisfied with the sharp clack it elicits. The first intentional noise I've made since losing my voice. I spent the next few minutes seeing what sounds I could still produce, even though the magic kept me silent. I could clack my teeth together, click my tongue, and even whistle, but any sound that should originate in my throat or chest was stifled. As always, thoughts of my voicelessness brought on thoughts of Yona, the damned elf. If I ever saw her again, I'd shake her until she returned my voice. Not that I thought shaking her would entice her into returning it, but still, my hands tightened around my mug in anger, and I threw back the rest of my tea, about to get up and finally wash my dishes. Right as I set my mug down on the table and prepared to push myself to standing, I heard voices in the hall. "Surely not, Tannel. I thought you'd said you'd sent notice to Eltor about the human," said one of the two elves who'd first overseen my arrival. "I did, Finane, and they just said that Assessor Yona had the final say in all assignments," Tannel replied. From his voice, I could tell he was the one who'd first told me to stand, and then shown me to my room. Finane grumbled a few nonsensical words, then said, "We're really stuck with him then? I suppose we'll keep him on returns duty. Out of sight, out of mind, you know?" I rolled my eyes. Fucking elves. At least I now knew their names. Tannel and Finane. Yona and them were on my shit list. I suppose all the elves were, as was Ortho, but those three were at the top. I waited for noises of them to fade from my hearing before I finally stood and washed, then put away my bowl and mug. If my internal clock was right, it was late into the night, and I would need to be up early again tomorrow. Who knew if Tora would continue to wake me up? Enjoying the story? Don't forget to subscribe and comment. Your support helps us create more stories just for you. All right, let's continue the story. Verbum Magia Part 6. I once again wake to the dim glow of the magical lights that illuminate the inside of the strange above-ground caves turned building. The constant level of light sears into me the horrible reality of my new existence in the archives. It's been 3 days, and I can't help but wonder when I'll next see the sun. If I ever will again. I give myself a slight shake and test my voice, just in case Yona's magic has worn off. It hasn't. Then I'm heading down to the small kitchen space. Another meal in solitary as the others talk among themselves, ignoring me. The tasteless orange goop, while sustenance, is such an unpleasant texture that I nearly choked this morning. Tora and Cook only look over when they hear my hand pounding on my chest, trying to get the air flowing once again. Besides two identical frowns, neither speaks nor moves to help me. Good to know I'm nothing to them, just in case I'd forgotten. After finishing my food, I make my way to the archive. The towering shelves of ancient texts greet me, their dusty spines just waiting to share their secrets with me. Taniel is in the archive today, and he eyes me with suspicion as I start the monotonous task of shelving returned books. It's all I can manage not to glare at him when he decides to follow me to the first shelf. As I put book after book away, it's clear he's waiting for me to make a mistake. After the first armful of books have been put away exactly as they should be, he leaves me alone to my job. I can't help but smirk, knowing that at least this isn't something he'll be able to take me to task over. There are no guests today, and after Tannel left, I'm here alone. The archives hold echoes of 1,000 stories, but my focus remains on finding the incantation or spell that might unlock my voice. I focus on my work, knowing that if I were to get caught reading, especially if I still had work waiting for me, the outcome wouldn't be good. My palms are itching to get into the books, having had a decent start to my research yesterday. By the time I finish putting returns away, it's time for the midday meal. I'm not sure if it's actually time, but unlike yesterday, my stomach growls demanding I eat. I turn and leave the archive, ignoring the books that are calling my name. Back in the kitchen, I find no one there. Not even Cook, but there's a covered pot on the small fire, and from how the dishes are stacked, I can see a few others have already eaten. Lunch must be a as-you-have-time thing. I scoop out a bit of what looks like noodles, giving them a small test taste before fully filling my bowl. No one is here to stop me, and breakfast certainly hadn't filled me this morning. I took my time eating, deep in thought about this god-awful world. One thing I had learned yesterday was its name, Zerelia. Maybe if I knew more about this world, and how they know Latin, or maybe how Latin came to Earth, I could find more answers. I once again said a silent thanks that Yona hadn't taken or dulled my memories. Honestly, the more I thought about it, she'd actually been pretty kind to me, especially as she saw me as a slave. I'd obviously taken her by surprise with my Latin, but beyond that, she hadn't attacked me, and she'd placed me where I'd wanted. There were a lot worse things than being mute. I certainly couldn't get in trouble for the things I wanted to say when they couldn't even come out of my mouth. When one of the other slaves, One of the ones I didn't know his name came in. I hurried to finish my meal before quickly washing my dishes and returning to my duties. A few more books had been returned. By who, I didn't know, as there was still no one in the archives. So I started putting those away. I was back in that same row I'd been in yesterday when the teen elf had sprinted in. As I was placing the book away, I turned and examined the section. Like I'd thought, it was all about the syntax and lexical choices of spell weaving. I didn't particularly think that would help me with my current situation, but I still reached for a book that looked promising. After all, there was no such thing as bad learning. But as my fingers brushed the spine of the book I had chosen, my eyes were pulled to the side, where one book was glaringly out of place. I paused, then grabbed it instead. Rather than a book on syntax, this was a book on the etymology of Latin. I grabbed it immediately. Had the teen hidden it here, or had it just been misshelved sometime in the past, and it was a coincidence that I found it now? I headed over to the same dark corner I'd been in yesterday and tucked down to read. I'd only read a handful of pages before I had to stop and completely start again. From my classes on Latin, I knew the language originated in what is modern-day Italy and was the primary Roman language. It was the mother to the Romance languages, and why I had so far assumed that everyone spoke English. However, this book turned all of that on its head. It implied that Latin was native to Zerilia rather than Earth. It was stated that it was a God-given gift to the elves. It also talked about how modern-day Zerillian was spoken almost exclusively, and Zerillian was definitely not English. While Latin maintained the alphabet I was accustomed to, Zerillian did not, yet I could still read it. How have I learned to read another language? And if I could read it, did that mean that everyone was speaking it too, like the book said? Was I, before I'd been muted, speaking Zerillian? I ran a hand down my face. God damn magic. I still didn't even know what all magic could do. Obviously, it could affect the physical world in instances like fire or creating a door where there's only been stone before, and more abstract uses like finding out the nature of a person. I guess there could also be magic that could change the language you spoke, especially if it was cast as I was summoned to this world. Had it stopped me from dying? Had I died when the truck had hit me? I felt sick and laid the book on the ground before I stood up and started pacing. I hated not knowing all the answers, but the archive was full of answers. All I had to do was start reading. Yes, I wanted my voice back, but if I could be patient, not draw attention to myself, who knows what all I could learn here. I glanced back down at the book, then picking it up and tucking it under my arm, I went in search of some paper and a writing utensil. I needed to decide what I needed to learn and in what order. Thank you for listening to the story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter. Your support means a lot.